In the quiet village of Littlehampton, where secrets whisper beneath the roses of Honeysuckle Cottage, a chilling mystery unfolds. Every midnight, the telephone rings, its silent caller breathing menace into the life of widow Eleanor Price. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eyes and gentle demeanour unravel a web of old grudges, hidden letters, and a desperate scheme tied to a long-ago land deal. As shadows move in the moonlight and clues pile up like autumn leaves, Miss Marple sets a trap to catch the midnight caller, revealing a truth that restores peace to the cottage, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 1. The Quiet of Littlehampton. The village of Littlehampton lay folded in the gentle embrace of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the amber glow of an October sunset. Honeysuckle Cottage, perched at the edge of the common, wore its namesake vines with pride, their fading blooms clinging to the stone walls like a whispered promise of summer past. Within its walls, Miss Jane Marple, her white hair neatly pinned and her eyes sharp behind spectacles, sat in the low-ceilinged parlour, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She had come to Littlehampton at the invitation of her old school friend, Mrs. Eleanor Price, a widow whose nervous disposition seemed at odds with the serene village around her. Mrs. Price, a slight woman with anxious eyes and a habit of twisting her lace handkerchief, poured tea with trembling hands. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, its warmth doing little to ease the faint chill in her demeanour. "Jane," she said, setting down the teapot with a clink, "I'm so glad you've come. It's been unsettling here." Her voice wavered, and she glanced toward the window, where dusk was settling over the garden. Miss Marple's needles paused, her hands resting lightly on the soft wool in her lap. "Unsettling, Eleanor? In what way?" Her tone was gentle, inviting confidence, but her gaze was keen, missing nothing of her friend's unease. Mrs. Price hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's the telephone, Jane. Every night, without fail, it rings at midnight. I answer, but there's no one there. Just breathing, slow and deliberate, then a click as they hang up." She shivered, though the room was warm. "It's been going on for a fortnight now. I thought at first it might be a mistake. A wrong number, but it's too regular, too intentional." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was already at work, turning over the peculiarity of the situation. "Every night, you say? At precisely midnight?" She took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Price's face. "Yes, exactly. I've checked the clock each time. It's always the same." Mrs. Price's fingers twisted the handkerchief tighter. "I haven't told anyone else, Jane. I didn't want the village talking. You know how they can be." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to her own village, where gossip flowed as freely as the stream by the vicarage. "Quite right, Eleanor. Best to keep it quiet for now. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Any visitors, perhaps, or changes in the village?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual. Dr. Grayson stopping by to check on my nerves. Clara Dunhill organising the Women's Institute. Young Tom Reynolds fixing odds and ends. Littlehampton is as it always was." Her voice faltered, betraying her doubt. Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting her teacup down. "Villages, my dear, are rarely as simple as they seem." She resumed her knitting, the needles moving with quiet precision, but her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. A telephone call, silent yet persistent, was no idle prank. It carried purpose, perhaps malice, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that even the smallest thread could unravel a tapestry of secrets. That evening, after a simple supper of cold ham and salad, Miss Marple excused herself to unpack in the guest room. a cosy space with chintz curtains and a view of the common. She placed her few belongings neatly in the wardrobe, her movements deliberate, but her thoughts were on the telephone in the hall below. As the clock neared midnight, she descended the stairs quietly, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and positioned herself in a high-backed chair near the telephone table. The house was still, save for the faint creak of settling beams and the distant hoot of an owl. At precisely midnight, the telephone's shrill ring shattered the silence, its jangle echoing through the darkened hall. Miss Marple's hand, steady despite her years, lifted the receiver. She listened, her breath held, but heard only what Mrs. Price had described. A slow, measured breathing, almost mechanical in its rhythm, followed by a faint click as the line went dead. She replaced the receiver gently, her lips pursed in thought. "Curious," she murmured, rising and returning to her room, her slippers silent on the polished floor. As she lay in bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, Miss Marple's mind turned over the call. It was no accident, no child's mischief. Someone in Littlehampton, or perhaps beyond, had a reason to unsettle Eleanor Price, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and unerring instinct, intended to find out why. Chapter 2. The Village Whispers. The morning sun rose over Littlehampton, casting a golden haze across the dew-kissed common, where sheep grazed placidly and the first leaves of autumn drifted to the ground. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a tweed skirt and a cardigan of soft lavender, stepped out of Honeysuckle Cottage, her umbrella tucked under one arm, as a precaution against the unpredictable English weather. The midnight call lingered in her thoughts, its silent menace like a shadow cast across the otherwise tranquil village. She had resolved to take the pulse of Littlehampton, for she knew that beneath the surface of any village lay currents of gossip, grievance, and half-forgotten secrets waiting to be stirred. Her first destination was the post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof, where Mrs. Carver, the postmistress, presided with an air of quiet authority. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, her smile benign but her eyes alert. Mrs. Carver, a stout woman with a penchant for floral aprons, looked up from sorting letters. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her tone warm but tinged with curiosity. "Staying with Mrs. Price, are you? She's been looking poorly lately." Miss Marple nodded, adjusting her spectacles. "Eleanor is a little tired, perhaps. The nights have been restless." She let the comment hang, delicate as a cobweb, and watched Mrs. Carver's face. The postmistress leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Not sleeping, is she? I said to Mr. Carver only yesterday, Eleanor Price looks like she's seen a ghost. All those late-night calls, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Calls, you say?" She spoke as if the matter were new to her tone inviting further confidences. Mrs. Carver needed no encouragement. "Oh, yes. She mentioned it in passing last week. Telephone ringing at all hours, no one there. Gives me the shivers, it does. Mind you, Littlehampton's quiet enough, but you never know who's about." She paused, glancing at a customer entering the shop, and lowered her voice further. "Some say it's that Tom Reynolds, always loitering where he's not wanted. Others think it's just the exchange playing up." Miss Marple thanked her, purchasing a stamp she did not need, and stepped back into the morning air, her mind sifting through the postmistress's words. The village was already whispering about the calls, though Mrs. Price had told no one but herself. Gossip, like water, found its way through the smallest cracks. She made a mental note of Tom Reynolds's name, and resolved to observe him closely. Her next stop was the village shop, a cramped emporium of tinned goods and gossip, where she encountered Miss Clara Dunhill, the formidable head of the Women's Institute. Clara, a tall woman with a sharp nose and eyes like polished steel, was inspecting a jar of marmalade with disapproval. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice crisp. "I trust you're finding Little Hampton to your liking?" "Very much," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "Such a charming village, though I hear there's been some talk of odd happenings." She let the remark drift, light as a feather, and noted the brief tightening of Clara's lips. "Talk is cheap," Clara said, setting the marmalade down with a thud. "People here have too much time on their hands. If it's about Eleanor Price's nerves, I'd say she needs a holiday, not idle chatter." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the mention of Mrs. Price stirred some deeper current. As they spoke, Dr. Harold Grayson entered the shop, his limp pronounced as he leaned on a cane. A man in his late 50s, with a brusque manner and a face lined by years of professional strain, he greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "Miss Marple, is it? Eleanor's friend. She's been under the weather, I hear." His voice was clipped, his eyes darting to Clara before returning to Miss Marple. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "She's mentioned some disturbances at night. Telephone calls, I believe." She watched him closely, noting the slight stiffening of his shoulders. Dr. Grayson snorted. "Nerves, that's all. I've told her to take a tonic and rest. These old houses creak and groan. Makes people imagine all sorts." He turned to the shopkeeper, ordering a packet of tobacco, but Miss Marple observed the haste in his movements, as if he wished to end the conversation. The shop door opened again, admitting Tom Reynolds, the village handyman, a young man with tousled dark hair and a smile that seemed to charm half the village. He carried a toolbox, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm. "Fixing Mrs. Price's gate later today. She's had a rough go, hasn't she?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes lingering on his easy manner. "So I hear, Mr. Reynolds. You must know the village well, being so often about." She spoke lightly, but her words were a probe, testing the waters. Tom's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well enough," he said, shrugging. "Folks talk, but I keep my head down." He tipped his cap and moved to the counter, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the faint shadow in his expression. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Price for tea at the vicarage, where the Reverend Mr. Langley, a kindly but absent-minded man, welcomed them with lukewarm tea and slightly stale biscuits. The conversation turned to village matters, the harvest festival, the church roof fund, and inevitably the undercurrents of unease. "There's been some talk of petty thefts," Mr. Langley said, frowning. "A few shillings from the collection plate, a watch gone from the grocer's. Nothing serious, but it's unsettling." Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought along in her capacious handbag, clicked softly as she listened. "Unsettling indeed," she murmured. "And these telephone calls to Mrs. Price? Most curious. Have you heard anything of them, Mr. Langley?" The vicar blinked, as if the question had caught him off guard. "Well, yes. Eleanor mentioned it in passing. I thought it might be a prank. Boys, perhaps. Or a faulty line." He hesitated, then added, "Though I did see someone near the telephone box on the green late one night last week. Couldn't make out who it was, mind you." Mrs. Price, who had been silent, stirred uneasily. "I wish it were just a prank, but it feels personal." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple reached out to pat her hand, her touch as reassuring as her presence. As they walked back to Honeysuckle Cottage, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of impressions. The village was a tapestry of small jealousies and old wounds, and the midnight calls were a thread that tugged at something deeper. Clara Dunhill's sharpness, Dr. Grayson's defensiveness, Tom Reynolds's guarded charm, each was a piece of the puzzle. And the telephone box, that solitary sentinel on the green, held a clue she had yet to uncover. That evening, as the fire burned low and Mrs. Price retired early, Miss Marple sat in the parlour, her knitting untouched. She thought of her own village, where a careless word or a sidelong glance could reveal so much. Little Hampton was no different. Someone, she was certain, was watching Honeysuckle Cottage, and the key to their purpose lay in the whispers she had gathered today. She resolved to visit the telephone box herself, for in its smudged glass and worn interior, she might find the trace of a motive, or a mistake. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The morning mist hung low over Little Hampton, cloaking the common in a silvery veil that softened the outlines of the ancient oaks and the distant spire of St. Michael's Church. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill, sat at the breakfast table in Honeysuckle Cottage, her eyes resting on the delicate china teapot as Mrs. Eleanor Price poured with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. The midnight call had come again, its silent menace as punctual as the village clock, and Miss Marple's mind was alive with the threads of suspicion she had gathered the previous day. The village whispers had given her a glimpse of Little Hampton's surface, but she knew that the truth, like the roots of the roses outside, lay buried deeper. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the morning light, "tell me more about your late husband. Arthur was a solicitor, was he not? A man of some influence in the village, I imagine." She buttered a slice of toast, her movements precise, but her attention fixed on her friend's face. Mrs. Price nodded, her eyes clouding with memory. "Oh yes, Jane. Arthur was well respected, though he kept his work private. He handled wills, property disputes, that sort of thing. People trusted him, but he was careful, never one to gossip about his clients." She paused, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. "He had a study upstairs where he kept his papers, locked always. I never went in there after he passed. It felt wrong somehow." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, seemed to quiver with her thoughts. "A locked study, you say? Might there be something in his papers that could shed light on these calls?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes held a spark of purpose. Mrs. Price looked startled, as if the idea had not occurred to her. "I suppose it's possible, but I wouldn't know where to begin. The key's long lost, and I've not had the heart to force the lock." She shivered, glancing toward the window, where the mist pressed against the panes like a silent intruder. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "Perhaps we might look together later today. A fresh eye can sometimes see what habit overlooks." She sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the study and what secrets it might hold. A solicitor's work, she knew from experience, often stirred resentments. Wills contested, lands divided, confidences betrayed. The calls, she suspected, were no random act but a ripple from some past disturbance. Her morning was occupied with a visit to the Women's Institute meeting at the village hall, a stone building adorned with faded posters for harvest festivals and jumble sales. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, took a seat near the back, her presence unassuming, but her senses attuned to every word and glance. Miss Clara Dunhill, presiding with the authority of a general, was discussing the upcoming bazaar, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife through butter. Yet Miss Marple noted the undercurrent of tension in the room, the way eyes darted when certain names were mentioned, Arthur Price among them. During a lull, Miss Marple ventured a question, her tone as innocent as a child's. "I hear Mr. Price was quite the figure in Little Hampton. A solicitor's work must touch so many lives, land deals perhaps." She let the words drift, watching Clara's reaction. Clara's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing. "Arthur Price was too clever for his own good," she said sharply. "Meddled in things that weren't his concern. That land deal, years ago. My family lost a good acre because of it. He said it was all legal, but I never trusted his smooth talk." She turned away, busying herself with a stack of leaflets, but Miss Marple saw the flush of old anger in her cheeks. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered, her needles clicking softly as she spoke to Mrs. Langley, the vicar's wife, a plump woman with a kind but vague air. "Such a pity about old grievances," Miss Marple murmured. "I suppose many in the village felt strongly about that land deal." Mrs. Langley nodded, her eyes wide. "Oh, yes. Clara's never forgiven it, nor has young Tom Reynolds's mother. His father, poor man, lost his best field. Drank himself into an early grave, after some say. But that was years ago. Water under the bridge, surely." She hesitated, then added, "Though I wonder about Dr. Grayson. He was involved somehow, wasn't he? Always so touchy when it's mentioned." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind catalogued every word. A land deal, a solicitor's influence, and lingering resentments. Here was fertile ground for motive. She thanked Mrs. Langley and made her way back to Honeysuckle Cottage. Her steps slow but purposeful. That afternoon, with Mrs. Price's permission, Miss Marple ascended the narrow staircase to Arthur's study, a small room with heavy oak furniture and shelves lined with legal tomes. The air was thick with dust, and a single window overlooked the common, its view obscured by the mist. The desk, solid and unyielding, bore a locked drawer that Mrs. Price had mentioned. Miss Marple examined it closely, her fingers tracing the brass lock, but found no key among the papers scattered on the desk. "A pity," she murmured, though her eyes gleamed with determination. She would ask Tom Reynolds to assist. His skill with tools might prove useful, and his reaction to the task might reveal more. As evening fell, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Price in the parlour, where the fire cast a warm glow against the gathering dusk. The conversation turned to the village, and Mrs. Price, emboldened by her friend's presence, spoke more freely. "Arthur never liked to worry me," she said, her voice soft. "But once, years ago, he mentioned a client who frightened him. Someone who came to the house late at night, shouting about a wrong that needed righting. Arthur never told me who it was, but I saw the fear in his eyes." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. "Fear, Eleanor. That's most interesting. Did he ever mention this client again?" Mrs. Price shook her head, her hands clasped tightly. "No, but I've wondered. Could it be connected to the calls? Someone from the past, perhaps?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, but her mind was racing. A solicitor's work, a locked drawer, a threatening client. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern faint but discernible, like the outline of a figure in the mist. She thought of Clara Dunhill's bitterness, Dr. Grayson's defensiveness, and Tom Reynolds's guarded charm. Each, in their way, was tied to Arthur Price's legacy, and one of them, she was certain, knew more about the midnight calls than they admitted. As the clock neared midnight, Miss Marple positioned herself once more in the hall, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The telephone rang, its jarring note slicing through the silence. She lifted the receiver, listening intently. The familiar breathing came, slow and deliberate, but this time she caught a faint hum, like the buzz of a distant machine. She replaced the receiver, her lips curving in a faint smile. The caller was close, perhaps closer than they realized, and Miss Marple was determined to draw them into the light. Chapter 4. The Telephone Box. The morning after the latest midnight call, Little Hampton lay under a sky of soft grey, the air sharp with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella in hand and a scarf tied neatly about her neck, set out for the village green, her steps measured but purposeful. The telephone box, that solitary outpost of connection in the heart of the village, had taken root in her thoughts. The faint hum she had detected during the previous night's call, coupled with the operator's revelation that the calls originated from the public box, suggested it was more than a mere convenience. It was a stage for the caller's silent performance. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that even the most careful culprit left traces, as inevitable as footprints in damp earth. The green was quiet, save for the distant bleating of sheep and the rustle of leaves skittering across the grass. The telephone box stood near an ancient yew tree, its red paint faded and its glass panes clouded with grime. Miss Marple approached, her eyes scanning the ground before she opened the door. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the faint, acrid scent of tobacco smoke. She noted the receiver, slightly askew, and the floor, where muddy footprints, large and heavy-treaded, marked the worn linoleum. They were fresh, likely from the night before, and too broad for a woman's shoe. Kneeling with a care that belied her years, she examined a small pile of dirt near the base of the box, finding a single cigarette stub, its tip charred but intact. She tucked it into a handkerchief, her lips pursed in thought. As she straightened, a shadow fell across the glass. Tom Reynolds, his toolbox slung over one shoulder, paused on the path, his easy smile in place. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Checking the telephone, are you? Half the village uses it, though it's a temperamental old thing." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth that masked their sharpness. "Just satisfying an old woman's curiosity, Mr. Reynolds. It's surprising how much one can learn from the smallest things. A footprint, perhaps, or a bit of tobacco." She watched him closely, noting the brief flicker in his expression, quickly smoothed over by his usual charm. "Reckon you're right," he said, shifting his toolbox. "I'd best be off. Mrs. Price's gate needs mending. Give her my regards." He tipped his cap and moved on, but Miss Marple observed the slight haste in his stride, as if her presence near the telephone box had unsettled him. Returning to Honeysuckle Cottage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Price in the parlour, her embroidery lying untouched in her lap. The widow's face was pale, her eyes shadowed from another sleepless night. "Did you find anything, Jane?" she asked, her voice tremulous. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "A few small clues, Eleanor, but they want arranging, like pieces of a patchwork quilt." She mentioned the footprints and the cigarette stub, then asked, "Who in the village smokes, do you know? Cigarettes, not pipes." Mrs. Price frowned, thinking. "Tom Reynolds sometimes. I've seen him with a cigarette behind the pub. Dr. Grayson smokes a pipe, mostly, but I've caught him with a cigarette once or twice. Not many others, though. Clara Dunhill wouldn't touch tobacco. She says it's unladylike." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. The cigarette stub was a slender thread, but it pointed to a man, and possibly one she had already met. She thought of Tom's quick smile and Dr. Grayson's brusque manner, each with their own ties to Arthur Price's past. The land deal, mentioned in whispers at the Women's Institute, seemed to loom larger, a shadow cast across the village's present. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on the vicar, Mr. Langley, at the vicarage, a rambling house filled with the scent of polished wood and old books. Over a cup of weak tea, she steered the conversation to the village's recent troubles. "I hear there have been some petty thefts," she said, her tone light. "A watch, some coins from the church. Most distressing for a place like Little Hampton." Mr. Langley sighed, his round face creased with worry. "Indeed, Miss Marple. It's not like our village to have such goings-on. The grocer's watch vanished from his counter last month, and the collection plate was short a few shillings last Sunday. I hate to think ill of anyone, but it's unsettling." He hesitated, then added, "I did see someone near the telephone box late one night. Couldn't make out who, mind you. Just a shadow, moving quickly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Near the telephone box, you say? How curious." She did not press further, But the vicar's words added another stitch to the pattern forming in her mind. The telephone box was a focal point, not just for the calls, but for the village's undercurrents. Someone watching, perhaps, or waiting. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Price as the evening drew in, the fire casting long shadows across the parlour. The widow's anxiety had deepened, her hands twisting a handkerchief as she spoke. "Jane, I can't help thinking these calls are tied to Arthur's work. He was so careful, but he made enemies, I know he did. There was that client years ago who came to the house shouting. I never saw him, but Arthur was shaken. He said it was about a mistake that needed fixing, but he wouldn't tell me more." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "A mistake, Eleanor? That's most interesting. Did Arthur keep any record of such disputes? In his study, perhaps?" She already knew of the locked drawer, but wanted to gauge her friend's response. Mrs. Price nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He kept everything in that study. I've not touched it since he passed. But there might be something, letters, papers. I just couldn't bear to look." Miss Marple reached out, her hand gentle on Mrs. Price's arm. "We shall look together, my dear, when you're ready. But for now, let's keep our eyes open and our wits about us." Her smile was reassuring, but her mind was racing. The telephone box, the cigarette stub, the locked study, the long-ago client, these were not separate threads but part of a single tapestry, woven with care and perhaps malice. As midnight approached, Miss Marple took her place in the hall, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The telephone rang, its shrill note cutting through the stillness. She lifted the receiver, listening intently. The breathing came again, slow and deliberate, but this time she caught a faint clink, like coins shifting in a pocket. She replaced the receiver, her lips curving slightly. The caller was growing careless, and carelessness, as Miss Marple well knew, was the downfall of many a scheme. Tomorrow she would return to the telephone box, and perhaps enlist Tom Reynolds to open the locked drawer. The truth, she felt, was closer than ever, hidden in the shadows of Littlehampton's past. Chapter 5. A Discovery in the Drawer. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Honeysuckle Cottage, casting delicate patterns across the parlour where Miss Jane Marple sat with her morning tea. The air held a crispness that spoke of autumn's advance, but her thoughts were far from the changing seasons. The midnight call had come again, its silent menace now familiar, yet the faint clink of coins she had detected stirred her curiosity. It was a small sound, easily overlooked, but to Miss Marple it was a thread in the intricate tapestry of Littlehampton's secrets. Her visit to the telephone box had yielded the cigarette stub and footprints, and now her attention turned to the locked drawer in Arthur Price's study. If answers lay anywhere, she suspected they were there, guarded by the dust of years and the weight of past grievances. Mrs. Eleanor Price, seated opposite, looked frailer than ever, her hands clasped tightly around her teacup. "Jane, I hardly slept," she confessed, her voice tremulous. "Those calls, they're wearing me down. Do you think we should look in Arthur's study today? I'm afraid of what we might find, but I can't bear this uncertainty." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes kind, but unwavering. "I think it's time, Eleanor. A locked drawer is like a locked heart. It holds its secrets close, but with a little care, it can be opened." She set her cup down, her movements precise. "Perhaps we might ask Mr. Reynolds to assist with the lock. He seems a capable young man." Mrs. Price nodded, though her expression betrayed unease. "Tom's always been helpful, but there's something restless about him. Arthur used to say he was clever, but too clever for his own good." Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple filed them away, her mind already weaving connections between Tom's charm and the village's whispered resentments. After breakfast, Miss Marple sent a note to Tom Reynolds, asking him to call at the cottage that afternoon. In the meantime, she took a short walk to the village shop, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones as she pondered the land deal that had surfaced in her conversations. Clara Dunhill's bitterness and Mrs. Langley's mention of Tom's father suggested a wound that had not healed. At the shop, she purchased a packet of needles, lingering to overhear the day's gossip. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, was chatting with a customer about the grocer's missing watch. "Likely one of those lads from the next village," Mrs. Gibbs said, shaking her head. "Though I saw Dr. Grayson near the green late last week, looking shifty, not like him at all." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Dr. Grayson's name, like Tom's, kept threading through the village's talk, each mention a stitch in the pattern she was forming. She thanked Mrs. Gibbs and returned to the cottage, her thoughts on the study and what it might reveal. Tom Reynolds arrived promptly at 2:00, his toolbox in hand and his smile as disarming as ever. "Heard you needed a lock opened, Miss Marple," he said, wiping his boots on the mat. "Mrs. Price's study, is it? I'll have it done in a jiffy." His tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance he cast toward the staircase, as if gauging the task ahead. Mrs. Price led them to the study, a dim room where the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. The desk, solid oak with a patina of age, dominated the space, its locked drawer a silent challenge. Tom knelt beside it, his tools clinking softly as he worked. Miss Marple stood nearby, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes missing nothing. The lock yielded with a soft click, and Tom stepped back, his face flushed. "There you are, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Price. "Should be open now." Mrs. Price hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the drawer. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm. "Shall I, Eleanor?" With a nod from her friend, she opened the drawer, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting neat and precise, almost scholarly, but the words were stark. "Leave things be, Price, or you'll regret it." Another read, "You've meddled enough. Stop, or you'll pay." The tone was cold, threatening, and Miss Marple's fingers paused as she read, her mind racing. "These are from years ago," Mrs. Price whispered, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Before Arthur died. Who would write such things?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, but her eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. Someone with a grievance, perhaps, or a secret they feared Arthur might expose. She tucked the letters into her handbag, noting Tom's sudden stillness, his hands clenched at his sides. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone mild. "You've been most helpful." Tom nodded, his smile strained. "Glad to help, Miss Marple. I'll see to that gate now." He left quickly, and Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts on his flushed cheeks and the way his eyes had lingered on the letters. That evening, Miss Marple visited the village pub, a cosy establishment where locals gathered over pints and quiet talk. She ordered a lemonade, her presence drawing curious glances, and settled near the bar, where Dr. Grayson was arguing with Clara Dunhill. Their voices were low but heated, and Miss Marple caught fragments. "Old debts, no right to judge, and Arthur's fault." Clara's tone was icy, Dr. Grayson's defensive, and Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her ears attuned to every word. When Clara stormed out, Dr. Grayson remained, lighting his pipe with hands that shook slightly. Miss Marple noted the brand of tobacco, similar, she suspected, to the cigarette stub from the telephone box. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Price, the letters spread before them. "These are no idle threats, Eleanor," she said softly. "They're from someone educated, careful with words, but desperate. We must tread carefully." Mrs. Price nodded, her face pale. "Do you think the calls are connected, Jane?" "I think it very likely," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. The letters pointed to a past conflict, perhaps the land deal that had left such bitterness. Clara, Dr. Grace and Tom each had a tie to that event, and one of them, she was certain, was linked to the midnight calls. As midnight approached, Miss Marple took her place in the hall, the telephone a silent sentinel beside her. The clock struck 12, and the ring came, sharp and insistent. She lifted the receiver, listening to the familiar breathing, but this time the clink of coins was clearer, almost deliberate. She smiled faintly, replacing the receiver. The caller was growing reckless, and recklessness, as she had seen so often, was the key to unraveling even the most careful scheme. Tomorrow she would press further, perhaps with Tom's help, or by watching Dr. Grayson more closely. The truth, she felt, was like a shadow moving closer, ready to step into the light. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The soft glow of dawn crept over Little Hampton, painting the rooftops with a delicate flush as Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour of Honeysuckle Cottage, her knitting needles idle for once. The discovery of the threatening letters in Arthur Price's study had sharpened her focus, each word in their precise, almost scholarly hand, a clue to a mind both calculating and desperate. The midnight calls, with their persistent breathing and the telltale clink of coins, pointed to a purpose that was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailty, knew that the caller was growing bold, and boldness often led to mistakes. It was time, she decided, to set a trap. Mrs. Eleanor Price, pale but resolute, joined her for breakfast, her hands steadier than they had been in days. "Jane, I can't bear another night of those calls," she said, her voice low but firm. "What can we do? The police, perhaps?" Her eyes searched Miss Marple's face, seeking reassurance. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes bright with quiet determination. "The police may come in time, Eleanor, but first let us try a little experiment. People, you see, act most freely when they believe they are unwatched." She leaned forward, her voice conspiratorial. "Suppose you were to let it be known that you're leaving Little Hampton for a few days, visiting a cousin, perhaps. We could spread the word at the shop, where gossip travels faster than the Morning Post. If the caller believes the cottage empty, they may reveal themselves." Mrs. Price's eyes widened, a mix of fear and intrigue. "But I'd stay here, wouldn't I? With you?" Her voice trembled, but there was a spark of courage in it. "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, her needles resuming their soft rhythm. "We shall keep watch together and see what the night brings." She paused, then added, "But we must be careful, Eleanor. Whoever is behind these calls has a reason, and reasons can make people dangerous." By mid-morning, Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Price to the village shop, where Mrs. Gibbs was arranging jars of jam with her usual bustle. "Good morning, Mrs. Gibbs," Mrs. Price said, her tone deliberately weary. "I'm off to visit my cousin in Chipping Norton for a few days. The cottage will be empty, I'm afraid. Could you keep an eye on it?" Mrs. Gibbs's eyes gleamed with the prospect of fresh gossip. "Of course, Mrs. Price. A rest will do you good, I'm sure. All those late-night calls, enough to drive anyone to distraction." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Mind you, I saw Dr. Grayson near the green again last night, looking all out of sorts. And young Tom Reynolds was tinkering with his bicycle not far off. Funny time to be out, if you ask me." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she noted the names, each a thread in the pattern she was weaving. "How kind of you to keep watch, Mrs. Gibbs," she said, her voice mild. "A village is lucky to have such observant neighbours." She purchased a skein of wool, her eyes catching the quick glances exchanged by other customers as Mrs. Price's announcement rippled through the shop. By noon, the news had spread, as Miss Marple had known it would. At the village hall, where she stopped to drop off a knitted scarf for the bazaar, she overheard Clara Dunhill dismissing the matter with her usual sharpness. "Eleanor's always been nervy," Clara said to Mrs. Langley, her voice carrying. A few days away might steady her. Her tone was indifferent, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands tightened on her clipboard, as if the news stirred some hidden thought. Dr. Grayson, encountered on the green, was solicitous, his brusque manner softened by concern. Leaving, is she? Sensible, with her nerves in such a state. I'll check the cottage while she's gone, if you like, Miss Marple. His offer was kind, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, and the faint scent of tobacco on his coat. Pipe tobacco, but perhaps a cigarette lingered there too. Tom Reynolds, mending a fence near the church, was quieter than usual when Miss Marple passed by. Heard Mrs. Price is off, he said, his hammer pausing. Hope she gets some peace. Those calls have been hard on her. His tone was sympathetic, but Miss Marple observed the way his eyes darted toward the cottage, as if measuring its distance from the telephone box. That evening, Honeysuckle Cottage was a haven of quiet deception. Mrs. Price, bolstered by Miss Marple's calm presence, drew the curtains early, leaving only a single lamp burning to suggest an empty house. Miss Marple took her place in the parlour, her chair positioned to afford a view of the garden path through a gap in the drapes. Her knitting lay untouched, her senses alert to every creak and rustle. Mrs. Price, seated nearby, clutched a shawl, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Do you think they'll come, Jane?" she whispered. "We shall see," Miss Marple replied, her voice low but steady. "Patience, Eleanor, is a great revealer of secrets." At midnight, the telephone rang, its shrill note slicing through the silence. Miss Marple motioned for Mrs. Price to stay still, letting the call go unanswered. The ringing stopped, and the house fell silent again, but Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the garden. Moments later, a shadow moved near the gate, cautious and deliberate. She leaned forward, her breath held, noting the figure's uneven gait, a limp, unmistakable even in the faint moonlight. The shadow paused, then retreated, vanishing into the darkness beyond the hedge. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Interesting," she murmured, her mind cataloguing the limp, the timing, the unanswered call. She turned to Mrs. Price, whose face was pale but resolute. "Rest now, Eleanor. Tomorrow we shall learn more." The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the telephone box, her umbrella tapping the path as she walked. The footprints were fresh, the same heavy tread she had seen before, and another cigarette stub lay near the door, its brand matching the one she had found earlier. She pocketed it, her thoughts on Dr. Grayson's limp and Tom Reynolds's restless air. The trap was set, and the caller had taken the bait, but the net was not yet closed. Miss Marple knew that patience, like the steady click of her needles, would draw the truth into the open, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. The Midnight Revelation. The third night of Miss Marple's ruse dawned with a quiet intensity over Little Hampton, the village wrapped in a stillness that belied the undercurrents stirring beneath its surface. Honeysuckle Cottage, its curtains drawn and its single lamp burning low, maintained the illusion of abandonment, while within, Miss Jane Marple prepared for what she sensed would be a pivotal moment. The shadow at the gate the previous night, with its telltale limp, had sharpened her suspicions, and the threatening letters from Arthur Price's study pointed to a motive rooted in the past. Her trap, carefully set with Mrs. Eleanor Price's feigned departure, had provoked a response, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, knew that the caller's next move would reveal their hand. Mrs. Price, though fortified by Miss Marple's calm resolve, was pale as she sat in the parlour, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Jane, do you think they'll come again tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That shadow last night, it frightened me." Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, met her friend's with reassurance. "Fear is natural, Eleanor, But we are not defenseless. Whoever is behind these calls is growing impatient, and impatience leads to errors. We shall be ready." She patted Mrs. Price's hand, her touch as steady as her voice, and resumed her vigil by the window, her knitting untouched but her senses alert. The day had been one of quiet observation. Miss Marple had visited the village green again, noting the fresh footprints in the telephone box, their heavy tread unchanged, and a faint smudge of tobacco ash near the receiver. She had also called on Mrs. Langley at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the bazaar, but her questions had turned to Dr. Harold Grayson's habits. "He's been out late recently," Mrs. Langley had confided, her tone hesitant. "I saw him near the green 2 nights ago, limping toward the telephone box." Odd for a man so busy. Miss Marple had nodded, her smile benign, but her mind had catalogued the detail, aligning it with the shadow's limp and the cigarette stubs. Tom Reynolds, too, had crossed her path, mending a gate near the church. His usual charm seemed strained, his eyes darting toward Honeysuckle Cottage, when he thought Miss Marple wasn't watching. "Heard Mrs. Price is still away," he'd said, his tone casual. "Hope she's all right." Miss Marple had smiled, mentioning nothing of the ruse, but noted the faint flush on his cheeks, as if he suspected the truth. Now, as the clock in the hall ticked toward midnight, Miss Marple positioned herself in Arthur's study, the threatening letters spread before her on the desk. Their precise handwriting, with its scholarly flourish, suggested an educated mind, but their menace hinted at desperation. She had placed a chair in the shadows near the door, where she could see without being seen, and instructed Mrs. Price to remain in the parlour, out of sight but close enough to hear a call. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of settling beams and the distant hoot of an owl. At precisely midnight, the telephone rang, its jarring note echoing through the darkened hall. Miss Marple let it ring, her eyes fixed on the garden path, visible through the study window. The ringing ceased, and the silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Then a faint creak came from the back door, followed by the soft tread of footsteps in the kitchen. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her composure remained unbroken. She slipped deeper into the shadows, her shawl blending with the dimness, and watched as a figure entered the study. It was Dr. Harold Grayson, his limp unmistakable as he moved toward the desk, a small torch in his hand casting a narrow beam across the papers. His face, illuminated briefly, was taut with strain, his eyes darting as he rifled through the letters. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying the weight of certainty. "Good evening, Doctor. Looking for something?" Grayson froze, the torch trembling in his hand, its light wavering across the desk. "Miss Marple," he gasped, his voice hoarse. I thought the cottage was empty. I came to check on things for Mrs. Price." His words stumbled, unconvincing even to himself. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes held him fast. "A kind thought, but unnecessary, I think. Those letters, Doctor, they're what you've been seeking, aren't they? The ones that prove your part in a certain land deal, years ago." Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, but it carried a relentless clarity. Grayson's shoulders slumped, the torch clattering to the desk. Under Miss Marple's unwavering gaze, he crumbled, his voice low and broken. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I forged a document for that land deal, to secure a better price for a client. Arthur Price suspected, kept those letters as evidence. I thought they'd been destroyed after he died. But when Clara Dunhill started asking questions, I panicked. I made the calls to frighten Mrs. Price, hoping she'd leave, and I could search the cottage." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanging. "And the telephone box, with its cigarette stubs and footprints, Those were yours too, were they not? You used it to make your calls, thinking it untraceable." Grayson nodded, his face ashen. "I didn't mean harm, not really. I just wanted to protect myself. Clara's been stirring things up, talking about the land her family lost. If those letters came to light, I'd be ruined." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her voice firm but not unkind. "Ruins, Doctor, are often built on secrets kept too long. You had best come with me to the parlour. Mrs. Price deserves to hear this, and the police will need to know." As they moved to the parlour, where a trembling Mrs. Price waited, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the final threads. Grayson's confession explained the calls, the limp, the tobacco, but Clara's role lingered in her thoughts. Had her questions been innocent, or was there more to her bitterness? For now, though, the midnight caller was unmasked, and the cottage could rest. Chapter 8. The Cottage at Peace. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Little Hampton, bathing the village in a gentle light that seemed to soften the edges of its recent tensions. Honeysuckle Cottage, its roses catching the dew, stood serene at the edge of the common, as if the events of the previous night had lifted a weight from its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, while Mrs. Eleanor Price, her face brighter than it had been in weeks, poured tea with a steadiness that spoke of newfound calm. Dr. Harold Grayson's confession in the small hours had unravelled the mystery of the midnight calls, and though the truth was sobering, it brought a measure of peace to the cottage. Mrs. Price set the teapot down, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with gratitude. "Jane, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice warm but still tinged with the echo of her fears. "Those calls, I thought they'd drive me from my home. How did you know it was Dr. Grayson?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "People, my dear Eleanor, are not so different from my knitting. A single loose thread, a limp, a cigarette stub, a letter, can unravel the whole pattern if you know where to look." She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the moments that had led to the revelation. The footprints in the telephone box, the clink of coins on the line, the threatening letters in Arthur's study, and the shadow with its telltale gait. Each had been a stitch, carefully woven into the truth. The police had been summoned at dawn, a discreet affair handled by the local constable, who took Dr. Grayson into custody with a minimum of fuss. Grayson, his bravado gone, had repeated his confession. The forged document in the land deal, the letters he had sent to Arthur Price in a moment of panic, and the midnight calls to unnerve Mrs. Price into leaving Honeysuckle Cottage. His fear of Clara Dunhill's probing questions had driven him to act, but his carelessness, the cigarette stubs, the coins, the limp, had betrayed him. Miss Marple, with her quiet insistence, had ensured his admission was complete, sparing Mrs. Price the ordeal of a prolonged investigation. As news of Grayson's arrest spread, the village buzzed with subdued surprise. Miss Marple, accompanying Mrs. Price to the village shop to dispel the rumour of her departure, overheard the whispers. Mrs. Gibbs, behind the counter, shook her head in disbelief. Dr. Grayson, of all people, always seemed so respectable, though a bit gruff. To think he was sneaking about at night, making those calls. Miss Marple smiled benignly, saying little, but noting the relief in the shopkeeper's tone. Little Hampton, like any village, thrived on its gossip, but it also craved the restoration of order. At the Women's Institute, Miss Marple encountered Clara Dunhill, whose sharp features softened when she heard the truth. "I never trusted Grayson," Clara admitted, her voice low as she spoke to Miss Marple in the hall. "My family lost so much in that land deal, and I always suspected he had a hand in it. But to frighten poor Eleanor like that, it's unforgivable." Her eyes held a flicker of guilt. as if her own questions had set the chain of events in motion. Miss Marple, her tone gentle, reassured her. "You sought the truth, Miss Dunhill, as any of us might. The fault lies with those who hide it." Tom Reynolds, too, appeared at the cottage later that day, his toolbox in hand to finish repairing the gate. His usual charm was tempered by a sheepish air, as if he sensed how close he had come to suspicion. "Glad it's all sorted, Miss Marple," he said, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Price deserves some peace." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on his strong hands, now cleared of any connection to the calls. His restlessness, she suspected, stemmed from his own family's losses in the land deal. But he was young, and time would heal those wounds. By afternoon, Mrs. Price was herself again, bustling about the cottage with a renewed energy. She insisted on baking scones, a task she hadn't attempted since the calls began, and the scent of warm pastry filled the air. "Jane, you must stay longer," she urged, setting a plate before her friend. "Little Hampton feels safer with you here." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles pausing. "You're very kind, Eleanor, but I think Little Hampton will manage quite well now. Besides, my own village has its share of little puzzles, and I mustn't neglect them." Her tone was light, but her mind was already turning to the train timetable and the quiet comforts of her own home. As evening fell, Miss Marple packed her small suitcase, her movements precise and unhurried. Mrs. Price, watching from the doorway, clasped her hands. "You've given me back my home, Jane. I'll never forget it." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes warm. "A home, my dear, is worth protecting, and you've more strength than you know." The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the train at Little Hampton's tiny station, her umbrella tucked under her arm, and her knitting bag at her side. As the countryside rolled past, she gazed out the window, her thoughts drifting over the events of the past days. The midnight caller had been unmasked, the cottage restored to peace, but she pondered Clara Dunhill's lingering bitterness and Tom Reynolds's restless ambition. Villages, she knew, were never truly still. New threads would always emerge, waiting for someone to notice their pattern. Settling back in her seat, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their steady click. The truth, as always, had been there, hidden in the small things. A limp, a letter, a whispered grudge. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unyielding curiosity, had found it, as she always did.